The wind was a living thing, a blade of ice scraping the flesh from bone. It whipped across the vast, indifferent prairie, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass and something colder, emptiness. She was a small, huddled shape against a rock formation that offered little shelter, her thin moccasins worn through, her legs stiff with cold and fear. Days bled into nights, indistinguishable except for the varying intensity of the gnawing hunger in her belly and the deepening ache in her heart. The buffalo had vanished, her people scattered like leaves in a gale, and she was left adrift in this ocean of grass under a sky that offered no comfort, only a vast, terrifying blue or a smothering, star-pricked black. Her name felt like a forgotten sound on a dead tongue. She remembered laughter, the warmth of a communal fire, the scent of sage and smoke, her grandmother's hands braiding her hair. Now there was only the wind, the endless sky, and the silence that pressed in on her, a heavy shroud. She had walked until her legs gave out, drunk from muddy puddles, chewed on bitter roots. Survival was a raw, instinctual thing, stripped of all grace or hope. It was simply putting one foot in front of the other, seeking any scrap of sustenance, any slight reprieve from the elements. She saw things, shadows that moved like wolves, the glint of metal far off that might be the terrifying pony soldiers, the remains of carcasses picked clean by scavengers. Every rustle of grass, every cry of a distant bird, was a jolt of fear. Sleep was a fragile state, easily broken by the cold or a nightmare where the faces of her lost family flickered just out of reach. Her body was a landscape of scrapes and bruises, her eyes wide and haunted, reflecting the desolate land around her. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, a tiny speck of vulnerability against the monumental indifference of the world. It was the smell of wood smoke that drew her, faint at first, then stronger as she stumbled over a rise. Not a village, not a camp, but a single structure, low and solid, against the endless horizon. Fear warred with desperation. White man's dwelling. But the hunger was a monstrous thing, overriding caution, overriding the stories she'd heard of their cruelty. She crept closer, moving from shadow to shadow, a ghost of a girl. A dog barked, a sharp, sudden sound that froze her. A door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the light within. Not a soldier. A farmer, perhaps? His movements were slow, deliberate. He stood for a moment, scanning the twilight prairie. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She pressed herself flat against the ground, willing herself to disappear into the earth. He saw her, his head turned, his gaze locking onto her hiding place with an unnerving stillness. She expected a shout, a raised rifle, the familiar terror of pursuit. But he simply stood there, unmoving. The moment stretched, long and heavy with unspoken recognition. He was a stranger, his face obscured by shadow, but there was something in his posture that wasn't aggression. Curiosity, perhaps? Pity? She didn't know these expressions on a white man's face. He took a step towards her, then stopped. He raised a hand, not in threat, but hesitant, open. A gesture she didn't understand, yet didn't feel overtly menacing. He spoke, his voice low, rough, the words foreign to her ears but the tone, not harsh. He spoke again, slower this time. She couldn't reply, her throat tight with disuse and fear. He waited another long moment, then slowly, deliberately, turned and went back inside, leaving the door ajar. He didn't close it. He didn't bar it. He left a gap, a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness, an invitation of sorts, or perhaps a test. She remained frozen for a long time after he was gone, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sheer bewildering strangeness of his action. The smell of smoke, of warmth, drifted out, a silent promise in the brutal night. She did not move for what felt like hours. Every instinct screamed danger, retreat, vanish back into the anonymity of the land. But the cold seeped into her bones, and the hunger gnawed relentlessly. The open door beckoned, a single eye of light in the vast darkness. Finally, driven by sheer, animalistic need, She rose, limbs protesting, and crept towards the farmhouse. Her steps were silent on the frozen ground. She reached the doorway, pausing just outside the threshold, poised for flight. The air inside was thick with the smell of wood smoke, cooking meat, and something else, soap? Cleanliness. It was overwhelming after the stench of dust and her own unwashed body. She could see him now, sitting by a small fire crackling in a stone hearth, his back to the door. He wasn't watching her. He seemed to be tending to something in the flames. He was a large man, his hair dark, his shoulders wide under a worn shirt. She stood there for another long moment, observing him, her young mind trying to decipher this enigma. He didn't turn. He didn't look. It was as if he knew she was there, waiting, but was deliberately giving her space, allowing her to approach on her own terms. It was a quiet respect she hadn't anticipated. Hesitantly, heart still racing, she finally stepped across the threshold, into the alien warmth and light. The door creaked shut behind her, soft, final. He still did not turn. He didn't speak right away, giving her time to take in the small, simple room, rough-hewn walls, a table, a chair, a narrow bed against one wall. The air was blessedly warm. He slowly turned, his face illuminated by the firelight. Cragged, lined, eyes that seemed weary but held a steady, assessing gaze. Not unkind. He gestured towards the fire with a nod of his head. Cold, he said, the word flat but understandable through context. She nodded, unable to articulate anything more. He stood up, his movements economical, and went to a small cupboard. He took out a tin plate and a wooden spoon, then went to a pot hanging over the fire. The aroma of stew filled the air, rich and savory. Her stomach cramped violently. He dished a portion onto the plate, chunks of meat and vegetables, and set it on the table. He gestured to the chair. Eat, he said. Simple command. No pressure. She hesitated, watching him. He returned to his seat by the fire, leaving her alone at the table. Her hunger finally won the battle against her fear. She sat, cautiously, and picked up the spoon. The stew was hot, nourishing. She ate slowly at first, then with more urgency, the rich flavors a shock to her deprived senses. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. He watched her eat, silently, his gaze steady but unobtrusive. When she finished, scraping the last morsel from the plate, he came over and refilled it. She ate that portion too, feeling warmth spread through her limbs, chasing away the deep chill. When she was done, he took the plate and spoon, rinsed them in a bucket of water and set them aside. He then went to a chest and took out a blanket, thick wool, smelling faintly of wood smoke and sun. He unfolded it and held it out to her. Sleep, he said, gesturing towards the narrow bed. She took the blanket, its softness a luxury against her chapped hands. She didn't know how to respond, what was expected. He simply watched her, waiting. She wrapped the blanket around herself, pulling it tight. He gestured again to the bed. She understood. She walked over, lay down on the straw mattress, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. It was soft, warm, dry. She closed her eyes, expecting sleep to come instantly, but her mind was a whirlwind of disbelief and cautious hope. She listened to his movements, stoking the fire, sitting down again. The silence was not empty like the prairies, but filled with the quiet sounds of his presence. The crackle of the fire, his steady breathing. It was the sound of safety. She slept fitfully at first, body tense, ready to bolt. But as the night wore on, and the sounds remained steady and non-threatening, she began to relax. It had been so long since she had felt safe. When she finally drifted into deeper sleep, the nightmares stayed away. The days that followed established a quiet routine. He was a man of few words. John. She learned his name through observation, hearing him refer to himself in mumbled tasks. He didn't ask her name. He didn't pry. He simply let her be. She was a shadow in his small home, watching him work. He milked a cow, tended a small patch of vegetables, chopped wood, mended fences. His life was one of solitary labor, dictated by the sun and the seasons. He gave her simple tasks, carrying water, sweeping the floor with a rough broom, helping with the cooking. He showed her what to do with gestures, with quiet nods. She learned quickly, eager to make herself useful, to justify her presence. He was patient, never raising his voice, never showing frustration at her initial awkwardness. Food was provided, simple but filling: bread, stew, milk, sometimes eggs from the few scrawny chickens scratching in the yard. A basin of water was placed outside each morning for washing. Clean clothes appeared one day, rough, oversized garments that swallowed her small frame but felt like heaven against her skin after weeks in rags. Trust grew not from words, but from actions. His steady presence. The way he left food for her without comment. The way he didn't demand conversation or explanation. He simply offered sanctuary, a quiet space to exist. He didn't treat her like a child or a burden or a curiosity. He treated her like person. A quiet understanding formed between them, a bond forged in the shared silence and the simple acts of living side by side. She began to feel less like a frightened animal and more like a small, hardy plant finding root in barren soil. The fear was still there, a low thrumming beneath her skin, a memory of loss and the lurking dangers outside. But it was tempered by a burgeoning sense of security. She started to observe the world outside the farm with less terror and more curiosity. The vast, indifferent prairie now seemed less like an enemy and more like the challenging backdrop to their quiet existence. One afternoon, while she was gathering wood, a wagon rattled down the distant track. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, instinct screaming. John, working near the house, straightened up, his gaze following hers. He didn't show alarm, but his body tensed almost imperceptibly. The wagon came closer, two men inside, their faces indistinct at this distance. Neighbors? Visitors? She retreated instinctively towards the house, wanting to hide. John watched her, then the wagon. He didn't tell her to hide, didn't seem overtly worried, yet there was a tension in his stillness. The wagon turned off the track, heading towards their farm. She darted inside the house, pressing herself against the wall beside the door, heart hammering. John walked slowly towards the gate, meeting the approaching wagon. She could hear the low murmur of voices, the occasional louder word, but couldn't make out what they were saying. She peered through a crack in the wall. The men were large, rough-looking, their faces sun-weathered and hard. They glanced towards the house, then back at John. Their tones seemed demanding, suspicious. She couldn't understand the words, but the body language was clear. She heard her own name, her people's name, spoken with a harsh, dismissive tone. They were talking about her. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through her fragile sense of safety. They knew she was here. They wanted what? To take her? To hurt her? She tensed, ready to bolt out the back door, disappear back into the prairie she knew could be cruel, but was also her only escape. But she hesitated, watching John. He stood firm, his stance solid. He didn't back down. His voice, though low, carried a note of finality. The men argued, their voices rising, angry now. John stood his ground. He didn't threaten, didn't overtly challenge, but his presence was a wall. He was protecting her. The realization settled deep within her, warm and unexpected. He was a barrier between her and the harsh world outside. The confrontation lasted only a few more minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The men were clearly unhappy, casting angry glances towards the house, but John did not budge. Finally, with grumbled curses and sharp words she couldn't understand, they turned their wagon around and drove away, the sound of their wheels fading into the distance. Silence descended again. She remained pressed against the wall, trembling slightly. John stood by the gate for a moment longer, watching the wagon disappear. Then he turned and walked back towards the house. He entered, his gaze finding her immediately. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't explain who they were or what they wanted. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. It was a gesture she understood implicitly. It meant, "They are gone. You were safe. She didn't know how to thank him, how to express the surge of gratitude and something akin to fierce loyalty that swelled in her chest. He had faced down danger for her, a girl he barely knew, a girl of a different people. It was an act of quiet courage that transcended language. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the farmer who gave her shelter, but the man who chose to stand against the tide for her. He simply went back to his work, chopping wood with steady, rhythmic strokes. She watched him for a moment longer. Then, a decision hardening within her, she went outside and quietly resumed her task of gathering wood, working with a new determination. She was not just a guest here. She was part of this place, part of this quiet stand against the outside world. Her hands, once small and idle, were now capable, calloused from work. Her body, once weak and starving, was gaining strength. She was no longer just surviving. She was helping to build, to maintain. The fear was still a part of her, but it no longer paralyzed her. It was a reminder of what she had lost, but also a fuel for the strength she was finding. This isolated farm, this silent man, had given her not just shelter, but a foundation to rebuild herself. Life settled back into its quiet rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. The confrontation with the outside world had solidified their fragile connection. The silence between them was no longer just the absence of words, but a space filled with mutual understanding and respect. She continued her tasks, and he continued his, but there was a new current flowing beneath the surface, a shared vigilance, a quiet acknowledgement of their partnership in this isolated corner of the world. She learned more about his ways through observation. He read by the firelight, tracing words on a page with a calloused finger. He knew the stars, pointing them out on clear nights with a gruff murmur she was beginning to understand. He spoke of the land, the weather, the needs of the crops with a quiet reverence. He was a man deeply rooted in the earth, patient and enduring, like the ancient stones that dotted the prairie. She, in turn, began to find her voice, not just in spoken words, but in the way she moved, the way she took on tasks, the way she looked at him. Her eyes, once wide and terrified, now held a steady gaze. She started to hum old songs from her people under her breath as she worked, soft melodies that spoke of mountains and rivers and open sky. He never commented, but sometimes she would catch him listening, a faraway look in his eyes. She taught him the names of plants she recognized, uses he hadn't known, remedies for ailments. She showed him how to track small game, how to read the subtle signs the land offered. It was an exchange, a quiet sharing of knowledge and spirit that transcended the barriers of language and culture. She felt her identity, battered but not broken, slowly reasserting itself. She was not just a Sioux girl lost and alone. She was a girl of her people, finding strength and purpose in a new, unexpected place. Winter arrived, harsh and unforgiving. The prairie became a white expanse, the wind howling like a hungry wolf around the small farmhouse. They were confined indoors, relying on the fire for warmth and the stores they had painstakingly gathered. The isolation deepened, intensifying their reliance on one another. They shared meals, shared the silence, shared the small, contained world of the cabin. She learned to mend clothes, to bake simple bread, to stretch their meager supplies. He taught her basic English words, pointing to objects, repeating the sounds patiently. She absorbed them like a sponge, her quick mind eager to grasp this new way of communication. She began to piece together sentences, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. One evening, huddled by the fire, he was reading aloud from a worn book, his voice a low drone. She listened, picking out familiar words, guessing at others. He stopped and looked at her. "You want learn?" he asked, speaking slowly, using the words she now knew. She nodded, her heart swelling. He opened the book and began to point to the letters, the sounds. It was slow, painstaking work, but filled with a quiet intensity. Learning the words felt like gaining a new kind of power, a bridge to the world he inhabited. It didn't replace the language of her heart, the songs of her people, but it added a new layer to who she was becoming. She looked at him, his face illuminated by the firelight, patient and kind. He had given her food, shelter, safety. And now he was giving her words, a key to understanding the world beyond the prairie. One bitter cold afternoon, a blizzard descended with terrifying speed and ferocity. The wind shrieked, the snow fell thick and fast, reducing visibility to mere feet. They were inside, safe for now, but the storm battered the small cabin relentlessly. A window shuddered under the force of the wind, threatening to burst inward. John moved quickly, grabbing heavy blankets and nailing them across the pane to reinforce it. The sound of the wind was deafening, a primal scream that struck fear deep into her bones. It reminded her of the helplessness she felt alone on the prairie, the overwhelming power of nature. She found herself trembling, the old fear resurfacing. John saw her reaction. He finished securing the window, then came over to her. He didn't say anything, just extended a hand. Hesitantly, she took it. His hand was large, rough, warm. He held hers firmly, not pulling her closer, just offering the connection. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, surrounded by the fury of the storm, it was a lifeline. He was grounded, solid, a point of calm in the chaos. She squeezed his hand back, drawing strength from his steady presence. The storm raged, but the fear began to subside, replaced by a quiet resilience. She was not alone this time. She was here, in this small cabin, with this man who had become her protector, her teacher, her unexpected ally. The world outside might be cruel and wild, but they had created a small sanctuary within it, a place of shared warmth and quiet strength. As the storm eventually lessened its fury, leaving the world buried under a thick blanket of snow, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had faced down not just the external threat of the blizzard, but the internal demons of her past fear and helplessness. And she had done it not alone, but connected. Looking around the small, firelit cabin, smelling the wood smoke and the simmering stew, she knew this was home now. Not the home she had lost, but a new home, built on resilience, kindness, and the quiet strength of two solitary souls finding refuge and purpose together. She was no longer the lost girl found in the wilderness. She was a young woman with a name, a history, and a dawning sense of her own capability. The future stretched before her, uncertain perhaps, but no longer terrifying. She faced it with a quiet confidence, standing on the solid ground John had helped her find. Years passed like the seasons, marked by the turning of the earth, the planting and harvest, the long winters and brief, vibrant summers. The farm thrived under their combined efforts. John taught her everything he knew about the land, about farming, about the ways of his world. She, in turn, helped him see the land through different eyes, sharing knowledge passed down through generations of her people. Their partnership deepened, a quiet, unbreakable bond built on shared labor, mutual respect, and the unspoken understanding that had first bloomed in the silence between them. The world outside remained, sometimes distant, sometimes intruding. There were still wary glances from strangers, occasional difficult encounters, echoes of the prejudice and cruelty that existed beyond the boundaries of their farm. But they faced it together. John, solid and steady, continued to be her protector, but she was no longer simply protected. She stood beside him, her own strength forged in hardship and nurtured by kindness. She had learned to read and write, her hands, once adept with beads and hides, now equally skilled with a pen. She spoke English fluently, her voice clear and steady. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, a blend of the resilience of her people and the quiet determination she had learned on this farm. She was a bridge between two worlds, carrying the memories and traditions of her past, while building a future in the present. The farm was their haven, a place where differences faded and their shared humanity shone brightest. It wasn't an easy life. The work was hard. The prairie could still be unforgiving. But it was a life they had built, brick by brick, moment by moment, out of kindness and courage. Her name, she finally shared it with him one quiet evening by the fire. A name that meant morning star, he repeated it, his voice gentle, and it felt like the first time it had truly been spoken in years. He told her his full name too, John Miller. Simple names for a simple life. But their story was anything but simple. It was a testament to the unexpected places where hope can take root, to the quiet power of human connection in the face of isolation, and to the enduring strength of the spirit to not just survive, but to bloom, even in the harshest wilderness. She looked out at the vast, starlit sky, no longer an empty void but a canvas of infinite possibility. The past was a part of her, a deep well of sorrow and resilience, but the future was a path she was walking now, step by steady step, not alone, but with a quiet heart and a hand reaching towards the dawn.